Welcome to another episode of Mindful Drawing. I'm Rooks is Fun, and I'll be your guide as we explore the connection between drawing, mindfulness, and some kind of creative practice. You may notice in the background here that there's quite a few technological things. 3D printers, screens, monitors, computers, different stuff shuffling through my other background hobbies of assembling the technology that serves in my creative practice, in the design of architecture, furniture, and spatial experiences, as well as doing some more digital versions of these type of drawing exercises, turning them into geometry and finding new forms. And from that, I'm inspired for today's exercise to take a little bit of a dive into the space of how we make curves and surfaces of a more flowing nature, both in the computer, but also with a constructed hand, something that we can bring that attention to the detail of action to and find a technique that allows for an expansion of our expression. We'll begin with a little warm-up that introduces how to kind of control and manage the relationship between weight and influence, as well as tension and surrender within the drawing of curves, something analogous to the NURBS of the computer program, but given form through our hand, through our eyes tracking through the points, through the breath and the connection of the body to each part and component of constructing those sinuous experiences. If this sounds interesting to you, grab a pen or pencil, something you really enjoyed drawing with, a pad of paper or sketchbook, and let's draw together. So I will begin with walking through a look at technique that we'll use as a meditation around kind of tension and release, or this idea of the surrender that comes from working with the flow, by looking at a way of drawing curves that is something that comes from the computer, from shipbuilding, around weighted curves. And so as a introduction into that technique, we'll begin just by making a sequence or series of dots, just little points on the piece of paper that kind of move along, undulating. A triangle is enough, 3 points, but we could have a few more working through the space. And this also just warming up our movement to start filling in a little space with the ink and the pen. And then we can begin to connect those dots in a, again, linear sequence, just a straight line between each one to link them up. In drawing that line, you can begin to have a little play of whether it connects center to center of the dot, or just lightly links them by leaving a little bit of a gap. The line can be generally straight, but it's more of a connection, just a visual expression of the link between those two definitions of space and place in the dot. So you can feel free to experiment with whether it connects cleanly or cuts through or whatever it does, just to create that chain or series. And then the first dot and the last dot in the chain will always kind of be a starting and ending, but the other ones along the way can all have some degree of weight or influence, a way of relaxing the curve that will flow, or of creating some tension in the movement. And we'll begin just by defining that influence, by expanding the area of the dot into a circle, something that reaches outwards. And it can be of equal size or playing around with variable size, while this technique has some connection to the way spline or NURBS curves are drawn. In a computer, we have a lot of freedom by hand just to play around with it. And the first and last one don't necessarily really need one, so we'll just leave them blank. And the part of this that will bring our attention into the space of the drawing, kind of keep our focus in the care and control of our hand and its relationship here to the page, will be the way a curve may start on a point, then deviate just to touch along the tangent of one of those circles to the next, staying to the inside of the curvature. And so when we reach to a place of inflection, letting that turn directions, and it might just go straight along for a while. And it's likely to miss exactly on any specific tangent point, but through the exercise, practicing that speed of the chain, the smoothness of trying to reach from one place to the next, and let this curve relax a little from the more rigid definition of those initial points that guide its creation. And this could be done other ways as well. You could practice going to the outside, just using the circles or the marks as a touch point or a place to let that curve sneak its way around, linked in space to the original points, but free to expand and contract and find some release from that tension placed on each of those points. But with that in mind, we'll move to the larger page. And that way we can start simple and just create a few chains of dots, taking a few breaths to stabilize ourselves, maybe to work a few kinks out of the neck and the shoulders, to let the hands, whichever you feel comfortable drawing with today, right or left, mix it up, move around the paper a little and just get a feel for that space that's in front of you, whether big or small, constrained by a book or open to the desk. Taking a breath in and then letting the pen or pencil begin somewhere where you feel the engagement of the paper and creating that first mark of the territory, defining next another location to begin a trajectory or a path of movement, breathing in between each location and just letting the breath out as you work that ink or graphite onto the paper. And these chains can be smooth in a direction and continuous, or begin to incorporate some inflection or oscillation as we breathe in to establish ourselves, establish a location, and release outwards to mark that place and define some space here on the paper. I think I'll work chain by chain, so after a few dots, 3 to 6 or 7, I'll begin again defining that influence, that expansion around each one. Another chance to connect and align more with our breathing in the practice of drawing. Again, establishing the position with the first breath in, and then a smooth flow as you establish space with the breath out. Playing or observing between your natural rhythms of clockwise or counterclockwise. They're having a continuity or seeing the opportunistic adaptability that comes into play. And we don't necessarily need these straight line segments, but I'm going to go ahead and add mine as just a nice short burst of continuing that breath flow in another movement, this cyclical layering of our attention, breathing in to find the dots and out to connect to its neighbor. Also as an opportunity to guide or establish the sequence. And bring some relaxed control into the breath. The line will get there between 2 points. It doesn't have to go fast. It doesn't have to go slow. Just at a rhythm that connects between us and our natural body rhythms and the movement of our pen or pencil. And then begin that smooth tracking to the outer tangents and edges, weaving through the inflection or wrapping in between and over those areas of influence. I'm going to begin the next sequence building off the first, just a little shifted in space, tracking a similar number of points, perhaps on a similar parallel trajectory, continuing to keep in mind a bit of that idea of tension and release, that expansion and contraction between points in space as they work to establish sequence, directionality from their non-dimensional existence as just simple points. And each new sequence, another chance to practice that alignment between motion, action, and our breath, connection, breathing out to connect and in to establish the position, bringing that same attention to the establishment of space around each point. That space may overlap, separate, or maybe shrink to engage the local territory. Letting the eyes and the visual processing into the space we're working with. They make some decisions of fit, adjacency, and context as we move again through the space to find just adjacent to the curve. And that flowing curve through the different points and their influence can be something you take slow and very deliberate and smooth between each connection to get the feel for it, or run fast and just let it flow out with a single breath. Try to map that connection as close as it ends up being, and letting some of the inconsistencies live there for now and potentially become something new in the drawing later. I think I'll do at least one more sequence, just slightly offset from that initial place, flowing now as we have more establishment of the technique through the repetitions, the breathing in to the place, letting it flow out in connection, or flow out in establishing space, working in your own sequence. You can follow along, or as may happen with our close attention to each moment, we lose a little track of the overall and may drift between which thing comes first and which comes second, but having the attention on where we are at each specific moment more so than where all the moments will end up taking us. In that space of mindful attention to the act of drawing and to that creative process, we begin to connect technique with our own interpretation and visualization of that technique to perhaps start to find some flow and guidance to the drawing. I think I'll begin a new sequence, maybe lightly mirroring or reflecting this one onto the other side of the page, just to work in a different direction. Part of that exercise of the practice, once the rhythm has been established, to then begin to test it, apply it, to keep it at the forefront of our intention and our thinking. Always being able to link back and adjust how we apply the connection inward to the breathing to create some outward expression here in the space of the paper and the medium and act of drawing. In this case, I've shifted modes in just establishing the points to begin. A longer form entrance into that definition of sequence and trajectory. Keeping my attention on the matching of the numbers of points and the general proximity awareness in space. Then able to follow that up by establishing the chain visually, giving it presence there on the page, one engagement or link at a time. Maybe getting lost or finding new paths, but trying to keep that connection in our attention. And as I spend a little more time on each component of this technique of establishing space, I can allow myself a little more time to adapt, to find nuance in that portion of the technique, in the current positioning of myself to the page, of the pen and pencil to my body as a connector, and of the flow of that medium out from my fingertips through the instrument onto canvas. Observing how the line begins from stationary to an acceleration, flow, and then a disengagement. Is it smooth? Or does it have stages of speeding up, slowing down, or feathering out? Taking time to observe the natural kind of rhythm and engagement that your hand might have established or past techniques might inform. No need to change them, just to observe them at each layer of defining these sequences of curves, of weight, influence, and relaxation. And it's okay if the breath falls to the background and the attention on the place of drawing and the action in the moment kind of brings itself into greater establishment in our foreground. But if you start to feel tight or rushed or notice that the breathing becomes shallow, you can always bring that attention back into play to smooth it out, to realign, and have a good baseline center to then work outwards from. Defining these new sequences, new connections, extending outwards onto the page. If we have a small clustering or constellation, we can begin to form that with letting our eyes observe and absorb what we've done here. So maybe taking a moment and letting the eyes close, letting them pinch a little bit tight to build a little bit of pressure around the muscles of the eye, and then to relax them open with a breath to re-see what's established on the page. And then decide to continue the chains or maybe find some new cross-linking between them to begin to occupy the new space of the drawing that we've established. To give the eyes some of that presence here as we have a territory to map into. I'm just going to begin to link the individual curves across space, forming surfaces, undulations in many directions, hills and valleys, ins and outs. And finding the subtle expansion and contraction between the moments that exist between the points, between the breaths, between the smooth and the curved, the straight and the flowing, and just seeing what we might find for the next couple of minutes of drawing. staying within the density of this territory that we've established becomes the next phase of the exercise of parsing that visual intensity and maintaining a pace that allows our eyes and to work together to see into that space, to make the connections and flow between one line and another, to start and stop with some precision, and to use the repetition as that practicing of technique, mindful attention, practice and flow. We approach the end of the time of the session and continue a few marks to complete an attention to an idea, to establish some visual reference or hierarchy, and to wind it down and come to a close, knowing or giving yourself the space for the exercise to have its end, that the drawing has no end or completion to it. It's just the collection of actions that have begun to establish themselves there on the page, and that can always return to the canvas or begin again with a new technique and see where we can take that into our moments of our life. Hopefully find some expression and creativity, a little flow of expansion and contraction throughout the day. Well, this technique is loosely based on how you might create NURBS or weighted spline curves in a computer software. That mathematical definition of the curve geometry that defines how we start to draw and form things and is used to create and design many objects we interact with in our daily lives was also extracted from an analog process of creating the spline curves, of using nails or actual weights to adjust the tension on a chain so that it would flow along a gradual curve to help with the construction of ships or arches. One maybe most notable architectural example coming from Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, very famously designed with the catenary chain system to track the flow of forces, to build in some surrender of the designer to the way the physics of material and structures operate in our physical space, letting go of some of the initial expression or invention of a formal territory to find something new. And it's a back and forth, a guiding of the resolution of the flow of forces, an articulation of the base, linkage, something that establishes a dialogue between the human mind and ingenuity and the way things want to work, often efficiently, hopefully safely in that architectural context. But we may find many things, let's say a tree or the form of an object inspiring, since its nature is derived from that moment of physical interaction, of tension between atoms, of particles connected in space. And that can ignite a process, a research, a connection between geometry and material that goes through its moments of translation as that branching structure of a tree developed to sway, to bend and interact with the wind, but not to support stable activities, not to hold floors or suspend stillness. And so for the human use, the architectural use, there must be another layer of concerns and considerations, of constraints and refinements to the natural systems we can draw so much potential from. After the work of the exercise, of focusing in on that technique, having just a little bit of time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes to really let go into the space provided by the construction of such a system, the expression of such attention and care in the act of drawing, just to discover and play and be free, can be so relaxing, so liberating, a surrender into what is found, for an opening up and an expression of that release from tension. I thank everyone for joining, and I hope you get something interesting, fun, or relaxing out of these exercises. Let me know below in the comments if there's anything you discovered while following along here, or some ideas you might have that emerge from doing your own drawings and your own creative practice around mindfulness. This is Rooks is Fun, signing off, and I hope everyone has a great week. Draw well. Thank you.